Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is my colleague, Forbes senior editor, Dan Alexander. Dan, thanks for coming on.
Hey, sure thing. Thank you for having me.
You were back in the courthouse, the Manhattan courthouse, earlier this week. This time, Donald Trump Jr. was back on the stand for the second time in just a few weeks. What can you tell us?
Well, basically, Don Jr. gave the sort of presentation that the Trumps gave for years to Forbes when talking about their net worth, but this time in an open courtroom. So lots of glossy photos, lots of superlatives. Everything's amazing. Everything's spectacular. Everything's the best in the country, if not the world. There was one key difference, though. Although they went through asset by asset, looking at all these pretty pictures, they didn't get much into the financials, which are the actual things that you use to value properties. So what they were really doing was sort of putting on a show to the judge and to the press, saying, look at all this beautiful stuff that we own, and leaving the impression that therefore it should be worth gobs of money, which of course it is. It's just not worth quite as much money as Donald Trump told his banks.
Dan, you were giving a play-by-play in the courthouse yesterday, and this is something you wrote. The Trump team displays misleading information on the screen in the courtroom. Can you talk a little bit about that? What was this misleading information?
So they did share some figures in slides on each asset as they were going through the empire, and some of those figures were incorrect. So, for instance, they said that 40 Wall Street, Donald Trump's skyscraper in Lower Manhattan, was 72 stories tall. In fact, there are only 63 stories in that building, according to documents filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission and also with New York City. The Trump Organization's explanation for that is that, well, actually there's space between the top floor and the spire. And if you count that, and then you also count some space in the basement, then you can conjure up 72 floors. When they sent that explanation back to me about a month ago, when I was asking about similar lies they're saying about the size of the building at that point, I then said, can you just show me a document that says that it has 72 floors, an official document, because I'm looking here at documents from the SEC and also from New York City tax authorities that say 63, and they could not provide one. So once again, they're exaggerating, boasting about everything that they can, including little details like how many floors are in a particular building.
Dan, if they're exaggerating, boasting, wading into miscalculating the number of floors in a building, does that count as perjury?
I don't think that they would be accused of perjury on that, simply because it's so absurd to lie about the number of stories in a building. And that being said, that wasn't coming from Don Jr. It was coming from slides that the lawyers were presenting on a screen that then Don Jr. was commenting on. So it's all just kind of, ridiculous, but I don't think that we'll see perjury charges out of them trying to convince the world that 40 Wall Street is 9 stories taller than it actually is.
And going back to Don Jr., what type of witness is he like on the stand? I know you said that the last time he testified, he was joking, talking fast. Was that the same demeanor he had on Monday?
It was. He really seems comfortable on the stand. He has a good sort of back and forth with the judge. He sort of jockeys with the AG's attorneys, but he's respectful. He smiles a lot. He really seems at ease up there. And of course, how could he not be yesterday? He was giving a massive sales pitch. This is what the Trump family does best. He wasn't answering a bunch of super difficult questions. He was basically walking the courtroom through the history of the Trump Organization and giving a global tour of its assets. Now, he did have to field a couple of questions from the Attorney General's office on cross-examination. He was noticeably tenser during that time, but that was just a short amount of time compared to the overall length of time that he was on the stand.
And did he move the needle in any way, either helping his case or hurting his case, or even his dad's case?
It's hard to imagine that a pretty PowerPoint presentation with lots of nice photos will convince the judge that the Trump Organization and Donald Trump Jr. do not did not commit fraud by lying to the banks about the value of these assets. I can't see it really hurting the case much either. At one point, the judge sort of joked that he had heard a lot of irrelevant testimony, but it went on for a long time. And, he also said at one point that he found it interesting and that the AG's office was interjecting, saying that they shouldn't be able to basically give the sales pitch on the history of the Trump organization. And the judge said basically, look, Attorney General's office had several weeks to present its case. We've only been here for one day. Let them talk about the history of the business. Let them talk about their assets. And plus, I find it intriguing.
I know that Don Jr. was speaking very highly of his father on the stand. He was boasting about his real estate business. Has Donald Trump, former President Trump, has he been in the courtroom at all when his kids have been testifying?
He has not. He was in the courtroom, of course, when he was on the stand, and he's been in the courtroom while some of the other witnesses were on the stand, notably Michael Cohen. But when his kids have taken the stand, he's opted not to be in the room. And I'm not sure what the strategy is there. Certainly, it's something that you would have to imagine he and his lawyers have talked about, thought about. But he hasn't been there to watch Ivanka, nor Don Jr., nor his son Eric.
And how would you characterize him as a witness, would you say, compared to his other kids?
Donald Trump himself?
No, Donald Trump Jr.
Oh, Donald Trump Jr.? He's much more relaxed. He's friendly on the stand. He seems to be comfortable talking about the assets. He claims that he has very little to do with the net worth statements at the center of this case. His name, the net worth statements themselves explicitly say that the trustees of Donald Trump's trust, which include Donald Trump Jr., are responsible for these documents. But in practice, how much did Don Jr. actually have to do with them? That's unclear. But he is not as involved in sort of the day-to-day management of the business as his brother Eric Trump. He described himself yesterday as sort of a big picture ideas guy, where Eric is more in the details. And of course, Ivanka has been gone from the family business for years. So when Don Jr. says that he doesn't know anything about this stuff, although the statements themselves explicitly say that he was responsible for the statements, it comes with a little bit more credibility than when his brother Eric says it. And Ivanka was just so serious and poised on the stand. There was no sort of joking or familiarity with the judge or anything like that. She was just extremely serious, much different demeanor than her eldest brother, Don Jr.
Dan, in the courtroom yesterday, did anything surprise you, A, and B, what are some of your main takeaways as you were leaving?
One thing that surprised me as I was sitting there was just, I've seen this sort of pitch before. This is the Trump organization is bringing the net worth pitch that it delivered to Forbes and I assume to other outlets for years now into the open court. And why are they doing it? Well, they're doing it for the same reason that they always did. They're being questioned about their net worth, and this is how they react. They say, we have beautiful stuff. Look at this. It's enormous. It's beautiful. Look at all the marble. Look at all the gold. And therefore, imply that it should be worth a lot of money. I expected their case to include more introductions of evidence, more hard numbers. And on the first day, at least, that's not how they spent their time. They spent their time giving a fancy PowerPoint presentation.
Looking ahead, is there anything right now on your radar that you want to put on ours?
Well, I think that the big question is what the size, ultimately, of the penalty will be for Donald Trump and his family. That's the big looming question, the big thing that the judge is going to have to decide. And when you look at Donald Trump's fortune, you have to realize that he could afford to pay a $250 million fine. However, if the damages start to stretch into, say, the $300 million range, then all of a sudden you're really getting close to the end of his liquidity, and then you can see real ramifications in the business. That's one thing. The other thing that I think that people should be taking a close look at is 40 Wall Street. This is the downtown property that Donald Trump owns. for a couple of reasons, there are some complications with this property that are going to really reduce the profitability of it about 10 years from now because the ground rent is going to skyrocket. Donald Trump, however, before that happens, has an enormous loan coming due of about $140 million on it right now. In order to pay back that loan, he either is going to have to lay out a lot of cash or refinance it with another lender. But another lender is going to look at that questionably because of this looming ground rent increase that's going to happen in 2033. And so I think that we might see some more news come out about 40 Wall Street. There was just a report that it moved into special servicing, which is sort of a first step in the process toward the long process toward bankruptcy. We'll see ultimately what happens with that asset, but I do think that as the judge makes his decision about what the ultimate penalties are going to be, and as the calendar ticks closer and closer to 2033, that's an asset to keep your eye on for where Donald Trump might face some trouble.
And can you characterize what type of news is coming out of 40 Wall Street? Is that good news for the Trumps or bad news for them?
It's bad news for them. So, this is an office building. And of course, office buildings are not great assets to own right now. It's not a normal office building, though. Donald Trump has what's called a leasehold on it, which means that somebody else actually owns the ground underneath the building. And Donald Trump has to pay rent to that family. It's a German family. That means that his structure is very different than if he just owned it normally. And so doing, for example, like a condo conversion, which might be one solution that somebody could have for a old office building, would be more complicated for Trump because he's got this looming amount of ground rent that he's going to have to pay in 10 years. And so it's a complicated asset, but the vacancy numbers are going up. The overall prospects for it in the future are going down. And I think that this asset that Trump has owned since the mid-1990s might be in real trouble here in the next 5 years.
Per usual, Dan Alexander, thank you for your firsthand reporting. We really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for having me.